Hi, Sinead and Andy, who've just joined us. If you can just mute yourself for now. You don't need to put your video on if you don't want to. You can sort of lurk in the background and listen to the presentation. Thank you all for joining us. I'm really, really pleased to welcome today's guest. It's someone I've known for quite a couple of years now. Phil Driver. He is the CEO and founder of, or co-founder of CommerceCentric. I'm just going to share my screen now with you so we can get our presentation up. Phil, thank you for joining us, and thank you for giving us the time today to talk to us. Now, just a little bit of an intro to Phil, and please, Phil, correct my facts here if I get them wrong, but 16 years in industry and retail and e-commerce, a heavy gaming background. You were the online marketing manager at GameStation. You've been a product manager, and now really you're, I guess, using all of that experience, you're helping businesses to, I guess, carve out their e-commerce strategy if they're going direct to the consumer. And that's my introduction. You're married, you've got 2 kids, and what everyone doesn't know is that Phil's in Taiwan right now. So Phil, do you want to just start off by giving us a bit of an overview of that and how you found yourself in Taiwan, and tell the story you told me about, you know, your journey over just at the point of lockdown.
Yeah, sure, no problem at all. So yeah, we're out in Taiwan. It's a little bit cooler today because it's been raining, so it's only 31 degrees today instead of up into the near 40s. So it's pretty warm here at the moment. So I've been here since March with my wife and family. We came over for what was supposed to be just a short trip, for a scheduled business trip to come over for some work that we're doing. I've got some people that work for us here, and my wife's originally from Taiwan and was coming back to kind of sort out a few things as well. Obviously, in the middle of all that, COVID happened, however you want to call it. And we were basically on the last plane out before all the borders were closed. Arrived in Taiwan. Well, they closed the border to Taiwan while we were in the air. But they let us in on a technicality of still being in the air whilst they closed that border. So arrived and was immediately told we had to go into quarantine. So we had to spend 2 weeks in a very smallish hotel room with 2 children, which was fun, but we all made it out of there just about. But and we've been here ever since, really. Just, well, there's no flights for a while, and we're also kind of riding out kind of the storm and keeping up with the news of what's happening back in Blighty. But everything here is fine. Everything's open. They're managing it very well, but that's because they basically locked the place down pretty early on. So it's been an interesting couple of months out in Taiwan, but we've been managing to work. We've been doing all our work from here. We do a lot of work in kind of Far East as well, so we've been managing that quite well. So on the same time zone for a change, which is good. But yeah, thanks for the introduction. So you went way back there, right back to kind of gameplay. That's a long time ago. So, but yeah, my background's pretty much all direct to consumer and e-commerce. Started off in high street retail, video games retail for Game Group, and a couple of different places for them. Moved into building e-commerce sites, worked for a big software as a service platform provider, and ended up building the likes of the first Ubisoft store, Electronics Arts store, where people were first starting to get into direct to consumer, and it was a lot of digital products, because digital lends itself to direct to consumer quite readily as opposed to some of the physical goods. So we built those big stores, and you know, they were amazing success stories of their time, you know, quite a few years ago. But EA went on to be turning over, you know, 200, 300 million a year, probably a lot more than that now. But at the time, that was huge for a direct to consumer store. Since then, went on to work for more digital direct to consumer places. So Riot Games, then went to be look after Canon, who was going through digital transformation, and take them direct to consumer as well. So new industry there with lots of legacy Japanese manufacturer, 100 years old. So obviously there's a lot of things to change within that business to help them go D2C. And also being a chief marketing officer for a direct to consumer brand, Wiley Fox as well. So lots of D2C, lots of building platforms for people, lots of strategy about how to take D2C forwards how to mix that with your usual channels as well. And then took all that experience and started to build a business around helping other businesses do that as well. So now I'm CEO of CommerceCentric, and we're direct-to-consumer experts. We help with strategy, but also with platform and taking people direct-to-consumer, sometimes for the first time, sometimes as a re-platform, sometimes as a rejig of their strategy. And we're kind of quite deep into that. And the other thing I like to do is a bit of a busman's holiday, but I like to interview people who are also in that space. So I also host the D2C Leaders podcast, which you'll be able to find on, it's hosted on Anchor, which is Spotify's podcast platform, but it's also on lots of other podcast platforms as well. But if you look for that, Anchor FM /D2C Leaders. And so we interviewed, latest interview we did was the head of direct to consumer for North America at Reckitt Benckiser, who tells us all about kind of building a P&L for D2C as well. So check that one out, it's a really good one. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell. And today, I want to talk more about D2C. I think you've probably heard lots about D2C. It's not, it's not a new concept. I think there's been a lot of rekindled interest in that, obviously because of COVID, because of some changes in consumer behavior recently. And what I want to talk to you about really is about how D2C can empower agility and changes within an organization and give you extra tools in the toolbox that perhaps you wouldn't have if you didn't have this channel. And just other ways of thinking about D2C as well. It's not necessarily just about having another store where you sell things. It could be something much more than that. So that's what we're trying to talk about today. So if we go into the next slide. So the other thing I'm really keen on, and I've done a lot of work around in this area, and actually did some of my MBA a while ago, kind of using some of these methodologies, is how do you build agility and adaptability into organizations? And the feeling now within the business community is that agility really is the new competitive advantage. It's that really helps you last into the long term. So obviously most businesses have some kind of core competence, but around that, if you can wrap agility, if you can wrap what they also call adaptability around that, then you're going to be able to last into the long term. You'll be able to face changes that appear, whatever they may be. And this agility will give you the ability to read no signals, but then most importantly, obviously act on those signals. And it's that being able to act on those signals that really kind of helps you. And so what we want to talk about is kind of how D2C can obviously help with some of that agility into that. So we just go into the next slide. So there's a couple of reasons that we want to talk about adaptability and change. And it's not just about kind of COVID, and it's not just about kind of high street, it's about how change is happening and how it's happening to businesses more specifically. And I really like this slide by Scott Brinker, which is it's called Martech's Law. And it's about how businesses start to diverge from technology over time. So if you can imagine, a business is set up to do what it does in a very good way. It's operationalized to work to its core competencies, and it progresses and it changes, but it changes at a logarithmic rate. It changes at a steady state, in that people build an organization, they try and make it work. They're not really trying to make big changes within an organization. They're trying to make sure that things are locked in place, that processes make things keep working, and they just improve. But that's kind of steady, generalized improvements going forwards. But what's happening at the same time is technology is moving at a exponential rate. So it's moving much faster than your business can move. And so over time, you get a much greater divergence between what you're doing in your day-to-day in your business and where technology is going. And this is a problem for a couple of different reasons. One, the technology you're using within your business starts to move away from kind of what's cutting edge. And we can, that happens, but it's the length of time that you allow that to keep happening. Because the longer you let that happen, obviously the further away you are from what's happening in the market right now. And so it can get to a point where you're actually on really old legacy systems, you've got old-fashioned thinking in the business, and you're not at cutting edge anymore, you're kind of way away from that. And you'll have to make some kind of seismic shift to kind of get back on track. And that's why you see lots of digital transformation projects, change management projects coming in. That's the business trying to readjust, trying to get back to where it should be in the market. So that's why it's trying to fit that gap again. But the other thing that happens is as that gap widens, other players can enter the market. And previously it was kind of thought that big players would come in, they would dominate a market, and because barriers to entry were, could be quite high, they would keep out smaller competitions. But actually, because the technology is improving all the time and becoming much more democratized, it gives the smaller players an ability to come in and using the technology that perhaps the incumbents are not using to surpass them, to come in at a level that's competitive enough for them to stay in there and grow. And therefore they can kind of push out the incumbent. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a seismic shift in the technology. It doesn't have to be something, that company in particular was invented and now they're, destroying the rest of the market with. It could just be they're just using better platforms that happen to be a bit easier to use, that are more user-friendly, and more importantly, probably cheaper as well. And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that within D2C quite a lot. And this is why D2C is changing as well, in that people have been using old platforms, and now newer platforms, easier platforms, cheaper platforms are coming in and allowing lots of new brands to come in and use those platforms and get to market. So it's just about how you think about that within the market. So that's technology, and we know that's changing. But we see some quite rapid changes in technology, but we can kind of see where it's going. We can see there's a trajectory. We can kind of follow it. So if we're clever enough and we've got smart people thinking about it, and we're thinking in terms of our company growth, we can keep an eye on that, and we can kind of see where it's going, and we can try and readjust. If we go to the next slide. So the other change is consumer behavior change. And this is, again, quite a slowish change. Technology affects this, as we've seen, the last 20 years with the internet, obviously people moving online for shopping, but actually that's been a fairly slow growth around that. It might feel quicker than it to some, retailers, but actually, 20 years is a long time in, for technology. So actually that's been, a gradual process. We've been watching that happen, and lots of businesses have been starting to kind of put things in place around it. But within that, technology of how people then interact online is changing, and that can change quite swiftly in some cases. So new technology might appear that makes it easier for certain industries to shop online as to others. And I think in the past, there's been this expectation that, well, this won't work online, but this will work online. But actually, it's becoming now, with technology changing, that anything can potentially work online, and it's just about having the right customer solution for it. And again, that's when disruption starts to happen. But obviously within these changes in consumer behavior, we're seeing some other knock-on effects that can affect go-to-market strategy. So things moving online, we're seeing a gradual kind of decline, people call it the death of the high street. And, the high street or, retail shopping is a bit of an ecosystem as well. So when high streets kind of decline, you also see the ecosystem, which is connected, start to collapse. And this is when you start to see these, ghost towns where it used to be a thriving high street and now things are kind of falling away. It's because a big retailer has pulled out of that city center. Some other retail have been, been using that footfall to drive customers, and it's all connected and it started to collapse. Or, retail's moved out to big retail parks and things like that. And again, shopping behavior has changed. People have moved down. And because of that, people are buying more online because the high street is not good enough anymore as well. Because, okay, there's nothing for me in the high street anymore. So why would I go there to wander around, the 18 coffee shops and 4 charity shops for the one shop that perhaps I want to go in? Or I can't be bothered driving out to, Blue Water or a big shopping center or something like that because it's far away. So I will shop online because actually that's the most convenient to me now. And so that consumer behavior exacerbates some of the other kind of issues within retail, and again, pushes us all to kind of looking at D2C as an optimal channel. And then if we go to the next slide. So then we've got this other factor in here, which is just unpredictable factors, things that we can't possibly, within reason kind of look at from a business perspective. I'm sure nobody really on this call had a COVID-19 kind of strategy ready to go for when this hit. We've had to just make do and get through that. And, previous to that, we've had, .com crashes, we've had financial crashes, we've had other things which are, maybe in some cases we might have got some kind of warning, but they're really big external factors that we really can't do much about. And so Again, if it's your agility within your business to be able to pivot and deal with some of these factors, and D2C can help you with that. Obviously, through COVID, the companies that have had a D2C channel have been able to pivot into that, some more successfully than others, but it gave them that route to market. Now, I'm not suggesting that, you know, you should carry on a COVID strategy forever, because hopefully this will pass. But again, it just shows you that having the options within the business to pivot to will help you. And the other unfortunate thing is that these unpredictable forces tend to push out businesses who have problems already straight away. So we saw some early bankruptcies and things in the early days of COVID. These were companies that perhaps already had some underlying issues as well. And obviously this has tipped them over the edge. And unfortunately, we might see some more of that. But again, it's these forces that are coming in and your ability to kind of combat them. Now, if you've got some underlying problems as well, that's what you should be fixing. But if that's not the case, look to your agility and how you can bring that in. So if we go to the next slide. So in the context of some of that, we start to think about, well, why D2C and why is that important? And so most importantly, D2C puts you back in control. So with the other retail and sales channels you have, you're never really in control, unless you're maybe an Apple or somebody that has huge amounts of brand power where you can dictate all your terms. D2C is probably the one channel where you'll be fully in control. You'll make the decisions about how that looks, how that feels as an experience, how you're approaching that market, your customer service, everything about that, you'll be making those decisions. So you're in full control of that consumer environment. The other big factor is it's really never been cheaper or easier than it is right now to do it. I think before, we've done consultancy projects before, and we've done, if I go even just a few years ago, if we'd gone into, do consultancy projects about platform selection and things, for the brands that were perhaps not direct to consumer first brands, because they by necessity tend to look at the cheaper options and the quicker options. But when you're talking to a big brand like a Canon or somebody like that, they want their experience to be out of the box great. They've got a level of expectation they need to kind of take to market behind that. And up till very recently, relatively recently, you really were looking at some kind of very expensive platform to go to market at scale. If you wanted multiple countries, you wanted a very good experience, you were looking at a Magento, something like that, a big platform. And those platforms are expensive. They're expensive in the first instance. They're expensive to build on. They're expensive to develop because you need specialist developers. They're expensive to run because you need specialists to run them. There's technicalities of it. There's hosting. There's all these other things, and it all adds up to big numbers. And that's sometimes, when you put that in the context of certain industries who are trying to develop an online P&L, that can be too much. It can be just too much expense to put into what might never make its money back at that cost. But now the market's completely shifting, and we're seeing much more kind of adaptable e-commerce, really high quality but cheap solutions coming in, the likes of Shopify, who are doing huge growth at the moment, who can turn up with a software as a service platform, give you all of the capabilities you need, and you can turn that store around in a matter of, it depends on how quickly you want to do it. Potentially you could do it within a week. Some, obviously, if you want to spend the time developing that, even, doing lots of extensive UX development there, again, within a few months, you could be up and running with a fully developed, branded store, all the functionality you could possibly want, running in any country you would desire. And it would be, relatively easy to do that. And so it's really, be turning the tide on some of that stuff, because in the past we'd spoken to quite a lot of big brands, and previously you're probably talking to a 5 to 10 year turnaround to break even on some of these product lines. If your product does not have huge margin, if you are generally selling, a volume, it can be a very expensive and dangerous undertaking to go direct to consumer in the past, but now much more easy to get there. The other big piece, really, I think that people are becoming more aware to is really that it connects you with your customers and gives you the data. And the data is the bit that's really, really important these days, because in the past, if you had a retail relationship, you really didn't know your own customers. You know, if you're selling through retail, you didn't know who your customers were. The retailer knew, and they had the relationship with them, but you never really knew who your customers were. You didn't have that direct conversation with them. You could not speak to them. And that's why, certainly within electrical retail, you see a lot of warranties, a lot of cashback offers, which is just a desperate attempt to try and get more data back into the business, to reclaim that data. And that's what they were doing. So D2C obviously puts you straight in contact with your customer. You have that direct conversation. You're speaking to them all the time. You're controlling the conversation. You're controlling the messaging that gets put out to them. And so, again, you're connected to the end user. You can find out as much as you want to about how they enjoyed that process, how they enjoyed the product, get feedback on that product, and really understand them over the course of a lifetime, rather than just an interaction via one of your sales channels. The other thing I think people are becoming aware of around D2C is that it gives you more opportunities. And what I mean by this is it gives you the opportunity to test and learn and do different things that perhaps was too expensive, or retailers were not interested in doing with you, or potentially you had some kind of conflict about. And that might be a new product. You might want to trial a new product. And in the past, you might have had to have a certain amount, a certain quantity to put into a retailer. Retail, obviously, are only going to do something that's in their financial interest to do so. They're not going to want to make a loss on something. They certainly don't want a lot of stock of product that might not sell, sat in a corner somewhere. So it's very difficult to kind of take new product to market in that test and learn approach. D2C, you're free to do whatever you want. It's your channel. You can test products in there, short runs, different bundles to retail, different combinations of product, different pricing options, and different pricing strategies, different payment strategies. So again, another thing that we're seeing certainly around FMCG, subscription models, hugely interesting now to some of the big FMCG brands. There, perhaps they would have kind of not looked at in the past, because it was everything's happening through retail. They're quite comfortable with that. But if you sell, well-known shaving products, and Dollar Shave turns up and Harvey's and decimates that market by offering cheap subscriptions, you're going to start to want to look at subscriptions. So how are you going to do that? What you're going to do, again, direct to consumer is going to give you the ability to try and test that, perhaps in different markets, perhaps not your main market first of all. Maybe you go do it in Australia before you bring it to Europe, and things like that. And all of those things add up to giving you more business agility. So they're giving you more options, more adaptability. Again, something changes in the market, a competitor enters the market, there's someone's doing something similar but different with your product. Something happens, COVID, something like that happens. Again, you've got options available within the D2C toolbox to address that in some fashion. And again, the technology in the process now is so easy that it would be, you should be looking at this. And again, we're having more and more conversations all the time with the likes of big brands that are looking to kind of do this. Sometimes just let's just see if it works. Really, let's just see if it works, get it to market, and then we might upscale it in a different way later. Let's just get it into market. And the costs involved are low enough that even if we lost all the money, it still made sense because we learned valuable insight. So if we just pop into the next slide. So, just on the back of that, so the routes to market that are available, retail, we talked about that. Now, retail's brilliant. If you want high reach, high volume, you want to be in every store, retail's the place to go try and get your product into. But unfortunately, as we all know, retail's got some big problems, high street collapse, finance problems. Obviously, COVID's closed everything, which is an ultimate problem for them. But they're seeing some perils. And now retail is never going to go away. It just needs to evolve slightly and readdress some of its internal issues. And, there will be some carnage as that ensues, but retail is still a great place for high reach, high volume. Distributors and wholesalers is an interesting one at the moment. So obviously they're stuck in the middle there. But what we're actually seeing is a lot of distributors and wholesalers are actually adapting to provide some D2C services now to brands. They're saying, well, okay, we know you want to go D2C, but maybe we can help you do that. Maybe we could be your D2C warehouse. Maybe we could be your partner to help you do that. So they're starting to fill that gap a little bit there and offer some of the services around it. And then the other super interesting one is big e-commerce, because I think for a long time, certainly brands have thought, well, we're okay. We sell online, we sell on Amazon, we sell on eBay. everything's fine. We've got a route to market through that. But actually, when you start to think about how Amazon operates, it's not necessarily you know, as straight cut as it could be. There's actually a very good article in Harvard Business Review about, you know, the potential big dangers of selling on Amazon if you are perhaps a newer brand that has big potential, because Amazon or any other big e-com retailer you like to pick on is collecting all that data. They're controlling the environment, they're controlling your products, they're controlling that pricing, and they are watching what happens. And over time, they may decide to get involved in your market because they can, and they've seen the potential of your product and other products like it, and they have all of the data and they have all of the customers. And then suddenly overnight, they decide that, okay, your bike brand's interesting. I'm going to make big e-com bikes and put them on my store. Suddenly then what's happening then? Okay, so there's a conflict of interest over time. Again, don't get me wrong, Amazon is amazing at what they do. They have huge volume, huge reach. You'll never be able to replicate what they do without spending vast sums of money. But having your back of your mind, again, that it's not your channel. It's never going to be your channel. They can be a fantastic partner for you. They can have, you know, provide you with good data and things like that. But again, they are an independent entity who are doing independent things. And so, you know, perhaps this week they're interested in your product, but next week there's a different product. They always will own that customer relationship. You won't have that. So how do we kind of address that? Again, we come back to D2C. It gives you that route to market, gives you kind of the agility, gives you the direct conversation with your customers, and, you know, in times of trouble can give you that protection for your route to market. When all else fails, you know, big retail fails all the time. If you were, you know, invested heavily in a big high street chain, and that collapsed, and that was where you were selling, what do you do now? So there's these things to consider. And we, you know, these are the graphs from COVID. We can see kind of, you know, what happened during that period. Again, this is an extreme example, but this could happen through a high street, you know, retailer collapsing or something else for certain brands. So we see their retail sales, and I think this was only for May, it's probably worse than this now. So retail sales collapse, but online spending reaches a record high. Obviously people heading online, it's the only option, they head online. So you need to have an option available for that. So if you go on to the next slide, we just talk about a couple of examples of how D2C can be used in perhaps a couple of different interesting ways as well. So this is Brew Republic. They are a beer subscription company, and we built their store for them. And the interesting about Brew Republic is that they are entirely owned by Laithwaites, who you may know as the wine subscription company. And so Laithwaites have developed obviously they're very good at what they do with wine subscriptions. They know that market intensely well. And they took some cues from the market. Obviously there's been some changes in the market. There's Beer 52 and other beer subscription companies like that. And they've seen the potential of that market. And so they want to go to market perhaps with beer as a new option, but it's a new thing for them. They know wine very well, but beer is new to them. So how are they going to do this? Also, they're sat on a legacy platform, and everything's focused on that platform. Internally, everything is focused on the Laithwaites website, making that work, making sure it never falls over, spending all the time developing that platform. So to take any resources away from that to do anything is actually quite detrimental to the main business. And as interesting as this beer thing is, we don't really want to mess with the golden goose in the corner here. So what do we do? Okay, so the option was we were going to spin up a new business, Brew Republic. We're going to keep that separate. We're going to build a new platform. Obviously, we're going to hook into the other benefits that the business brings, which is their warehousing, customer service, the things that they do really, really well. But where they're looking to take that away from, okay, well, let's look to a different platform. And in this case, they went to Shopify, and this is built on Shopify to do that. And that's kept separate, systems are separate, but the back ends are connected. And so they can take this to market. It's almost like a test. They're investing. They've got a good idea that this is going to work for them. And in fact, it is working for them. You know, they've had, you know, exceptional results. They luckily launched just in time earlier this year. So we got that out on time, on budget. But it was still, you know, a test in that they've got a new brand. Let's take it to market, but let's do it differently. Let's take it away from our core product, our core platform, and we'll do it differently, just to make sure that we're not interfering with that, but also we're learning something new. We're learning a new platform, because potentially in the future we want to re-platform for the old site, or we want to learn a different way of doing something for the old site. So this is a new opportunity with a new business to go to market, learn something on a new platform, do something differently, and we'll keep all those learnings in the business and we'll put them back into the rest later on. So it's just a really interesting way of approaching D2C. Certainly with sub-brands, if you've got sub-brands within your brands, taking them to market on different platforms, potentially giving different options. And again, the flexibility of these SaaS platforms now is such that you're really not locking yourself in any particular way. It's just a very swift way to get to market. So that's that one. And then if we just flick onto the next slide. And again, the other argument that we used to get was, well, some things can't be sold D2C. You can't sell this on D2C. It's impossible. It can only be sold in a retail environment. And actually, it turns out that's probably not true. We're seeing a lot of changes, certainly in FMCG. A lot of FMCG brands now going direct to consumer in different ways. And again, we talked about subscription models there. But this fairly recently launched, this isn't one of ours, but Lever Direct launched this site, again on Shopify. And it's bundling their products, taking them direct to consumer. And it's things that you would think can only be sold in the supermarket. It's cleaning, it's washing, items that, historically people have thought perhaps you wouldn't be able to sell that direct to consumer, but there's a need, there's a desire to buy that. They wouldn't have done this otherwise. It is for them still potentially a test, because I know for a fact that this was launched in certain countries and they're still looking at other countries potentially in the future to then relaunch into other countries. But they can manage to do it because the platform's flexibility allows you to get this up and running in a relatively small amount of time, in a relatively good budget, with little requirements for extensive merchandising or manipulation. You don't need huge teams to get this going. You can spin this up with a fairly agile team and get to market rapidly. So again, they're seeing the value in doing that. And if it sticks, they will obviously grow on it. They will make it kind of bigger and better and add more products and potentially look at other solutions around that as well. We do a lot of work with Reckitt Benckiser. Again, they have gone pretty hard on their direct to consumer now. And, they've got Durex, they've got Scholl, they've got, baby milk formula, a lot of those brands. And again, it's things that potentially you would never have thought about selling D2C, but there is a desire for those products. There is a market for them. Now, behind that, the strategy has to be in place, and, you have to build your P&L to match what you're going to be spending here. But again, they're using, flexible platforms. Again, Scholl and Durex, and most of Reckitt Benckaiser's platform is Shopify. So they're going to market, they're getting to market quickly, they're learning and finding out, again, how to deal with their customers online. And then if we just pop to the final slide. The other thing to bear in mind, however, is that it's easy to get to market, much easier than it ever has been now. But there are still some big considerations that you need to be aware of. So as soon as you are going direct to consumer, you are in charge of marketing, which you've potentially never done from a consumer sales point of view before. Sure, lots of brands do lots of brand marketing. Certainly, we've seen that in the big changes happening within Canon and some of the other big companies we've worked with. But to do marketing for e-commerce is a very different undertaking. It's a very different attitude. You've got to figure out how e-commerce sits within your marketing mix and how it sits within your business. You're in charge of that now. You need to figure that out. You're also in charge of lots of very unsexy things: tax, payment methods, fraud and chargebacks, regulatory compliance, things that you really don't want to have to think about, but you will have to think about. And you'll have to bring your finance teams into the process to make sure that you are, undertaking that in the correct way. Tax and legal is always going to be the bit where you probably spend the most of your time, the bit that you need to get right as well, unfortunately, because you can have some serious issues if you don't do that. You're also going to deal with channel conflicts, because you now are, in essence, conflicting with your retail partners. That cannot be avoided, because The opposite to, you know, being in conflict is being in collusion with them, which would be even worse and is an illegal activity, obviously. So you have to, you know, take that on board to manage that as well. You know, you have to be doing that. But most importantly, you're now in charge of complete customer satisfaction from end to end. Now, before you were just in charge of your product, making sure your product was good. Now you're in charge of making sure the entire system of getting your product needs to match that expectation. And that's really difficult. That's the bit where, again, you have to spend some real time in there. It's like, okay, so we know how to make our product, but how do we make the experience of buying our product fantastic? How do we make the experience of delivering our product fantastic? How do we make the experience of actually taking our product back because it's broken really good? You know, what does all that need to feel like? What does that need to look like? And that has to match what your brand expectation is like. You know, that has to match with that, because if it doesn't, you're detrimenting your own brand. Because if your brand is, you know, has a certain level of gravitas in the market, if your e-commerce experience doesn't match that, you're at odds with your own brand. So that's the other big consideration, and that can weigh pretty heavy on D2C shoulders. And Imtiaz, who's the D2C leader for Reckitt Benckiser, came on the podcast a while ago, and he gave us a really good story about Enfamil in the US during COVID. And, you know, baby products, not necessarily just for Reckitt Benckiser, but for everybody, baby products increased in sales online by nearly 60% during COVID. So suddenly you're dealing with that amount of volume through your D2C channel. You know, perhaps for some, you know, parents in the market, you were the only option for them to get baby milk. The responsibility on your shoulders to keep babies fed during a time of crisis and deliver a great brand experience and a great delivery experience when you're overstretched and overstressed. You know, there's a lot of responsibility within that. So you've got to take that in mind as well, that potentially you've got to be delivering that expectation against what people expect of you as well. And, you know, for them, they managed to get through that by doing, you know, working with some good partners and pushing through. But it could have been a very different story. You know, it could have been, you know, Enfamil lets everybody down with milk deliveries during a time of crisis, but it wasn't. It was a real good success story for them, delivering against all the odds. So I think it's taking that on board is one of the things. So I think the moral of the story is that D2C can bring you lots of agility, lots of options that you perhaps wouldn't have before, give you perhaps sometimes a bigger stick as well, if you need that stick to talk to retail, to talk to your other partners as well, because you know you've got this other option. It gives you all these things, but it has to be built in the right way. You have to be building your strategy around it. Can you get to market very quickly and quicker than ever before? Absolutely. But you still need to put the thought in there about the strategy and how you're going to approach that and make sure that matches with brand expectations. So that's D2C agility. And that is the end.
Phil, that was brilliant. Thank you very, very much. I thought it was really, really interesting. You've covered so much detail there, and I mean, okay, I'm not an expert in e-commerce, but I've clearly learned lots and lots of information here. I've written everything down, and and I'm sure there's going to be some people on the call. I know straight away that Tracy, if she's still on the call, and also Andy Flack will want to ask you some questions. But it strikes me that e-commerce is kind of going through another disruption. So e-commerce back in the day was the first disruption, but it was a very clunky online process from what I remember. And technology has obviously fast-tracked that. I mean, I remember boo.com going down and going under back in the early 2000s because the technology just wasn't there for them to sell their products online, and they were selling luxury brands, but they weren't able to do it quickly enough. You mentioned Shopify and other SaaS platforms that are making it more user-friendly, better platforms, cheaper. Is it kind of similar to where fintechs were a couple of years, you know, the likes of Revolut now, and how maybe building societies and banks are trying to catch up? Is that a kind of similar thing, really?
Yeah, I mean, that for me, that's all still e-commerce. You know, what they're doing, whilst it was in the realm of fintech, it's all still e-commerce and consumer journeys. But essentially, yes, it's like just improving those journeys, making them much slicker. But in the past, there was so much overhead to get to a really good experience. You know, if I think about some of the budgets that I'm aware of some of the platforms out there, you know, the likes of Kingfisher Group and how much they spent on their platform to make it, you know, a platform that could handle millions of products and still give a, you know, great experience and things like that. And, you know, even what just a couple of years ago we were spending at Canon on Oracle and things like, and those kind of platforms. And the change and what you can now do with what would have been considered inferior platforms, you know, a few years ago is now amazing. And the amount of tech you can get out of the box with these SaaS platforms is just it unlocks loads of potential. And again, that's why if you're savvy, you can do so much with so little now. But yeah, the whole market is moving along. Now, there'll still be super high end. I think there's you know, I'm not saying that big platforms are going to disappear altogether. If you've got a requirement for a global platform that can handle, you know, millions of SKUs, you're probably looking at something much more specialized with lots of intensive work on that there. But for most people, don't need that. You know, most brands don't have that many products. So getting up and running with something that out of the box that will look good, that will feel good, that will give customers all what they're expecting from e-commerce, and actually has quite a diverse range of, you know, apps and other things that you can plug in there and to give you other options potentially, without the need to develop things individually. You know, it's just the ecosystem around things is growing so rapidly that the need to spend huge amounts of time developing like custom tools and widgets and things like this, it falls away, and there's other options available.
Interesting, really interesting. I'm going to bring in, well, I'm going to say anybody who wants to ask a question, I think there's a button you can digitally raise your hand, or you can just wave and I'll bring you in. But I think I'm going to pick on someone. So Mr. Flack, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, because I know that, you know, give us an overview of you, Andy, and what you've been doing with World Stores and Dunelm. And then that maybe give a bit of context, and it gives a bit of an overview of your experience with e-commerce.
Okay, yeah, I was listening to that, Phil. It was very good, and I was sort of like mapping it against various points on my journey over the last 20 odd years. What background for me? World Stores, which was basically a number of niche sites. We had, I think, at high watermark 85 different niche sites which were selling things. You know, one site might be selling lawnmowers, another site might be selling bar stores, another site might be selling beds. So we had a mechanism whereby we could roll these out. So I was interested when you said, you know, it only takes a week maybe to put a new site up now. We were doing it in 2 days a while back. And that was, you know, a complete set of how many thousand products we're going to put on this, on it goes, and working from that. Very, very much agree with you with regards to your comments around Amazon. Amazon own the relationship with the customer. You don't get to see it. And they are the tiger in the room. Yeah, you've got to be very careful. You are spending money with them and paying your competition to actually get better if you're not careful. So, you know, can be a bit of a two-edged sword there. Yeah, so me going on from World Stores, where we had all of these different sites, and integrating using Amazon, using eBay, then we got bought out by Dunelm. Now, Dunelm is a completely different environment with regards to, it is primarily bricks and mortar, and it's also got a website. World Stores was all website, no bricks and mortar. So completely different approaches. Coming into Dunelm with in that retail environment, and then seeing what happened with the COVID in particular. So COVID went through a phase of, oh dear, everything locks down, close everything down. Website goes into virtually dormant mode. For a couple of hours, it went to, sorry, we're working on this sort of thing, marker on the screen. Then it was, okay, you can look at everything on here, but we're not going to let you buy anything because we can't actually deliver it, because none of our carriers are working and none of our suppliers are going to be able to put it in on the carrier, and our warehouse is closed down at the moment, so we can show but can't tell, you know. So then we moved on to gradually opening up the various carriers, so when they became available, and opening up the suppliers, our dropship suppliers, which we had about 250 of, as they became capable to the level of their capacity that they could deal with it. So we were seeing a traffic pattern which was basically Christmas 2019 that level, COVID like just underneath it or just above it all the time. Yeah, and rather than just being a Christmas Day, Boxing Day start of sales peak, it was a continuous peak that was happening. People really wanted stuff. You know, you may wonder why they want cushions and curtains and things like that during a COVID outbreak, but they wanted this stuff now. And they were booking this stuff out to sort of like into July, yeah, because our suppliers were only just been able to trickle feed the product in because they didn't, because of social spacing and everything else. So we had to make allowance for the fact that they couldn't actually deliver this thing for another X weeks, months maybe. So these things were being pushed way out into the future with regards to when they were going to be available, which in itself suppresses the demand because the availability is so bad. But we were still having this at sort of at maximum peak. Then what we managed to do was we managed to bring in click and collect from the actual stores. Bringing in click and collect from the stores meant that the online traffic dropped because a lot of it shifted over onto click and collect. Then as we opened the stores, the click and collect traffic dropped, the online traffic dropped, and it all went over, well, not all of it, but a large proportion of it went over to get it from the store. What this actually really shows is that the customer is following one line, which is, I want it now, or as soon to now as I can possibly have it. Okay. Yeah. And if that means that I'm going to have to wait because that's the soonest I can have it, I'll wait. And if it's, I can actually get in the car and go somewhere and pick it up from somewhere, I'll do that. And if it means I can go to the shop and pick it up now, I'll go and do that. And you get these different layers of the customer, if you like, moving out into these different fulfillment processes. So yeah, that's background of me. But the other, with regards to what you were saying with regards to the responsibility, taking on everything for the your relationship with the customer, this is really a two-edged sword. You've got to be careful. You are raising the stakes of the game. Yeah, you are now saying, I am now responsible for the final mile delivery. Yeah, whether the guy throws it over the hedge or whether he actually hands it to you. I am now responsible for all of the issues with regards to you have a problem, you want to speak to somebody and sort it out. So your customer service setup better be up to it. Otherwise, you're going to suddenly find yourself being lambasted for poor customer service, and that can really take off through social media. The actual, as I said, you're raising the stakes in the game. Yeah, you've got to take responsibility for everything. If you don't take responsibility for everything and actually start dealing with it, you're really just giving yourself another problem. I think that's me for the moment.
That's great, Andrew. And Phil, you said that in your presentation right at the end. You know, customer satisfaction is the most important thing, and you've got all of these brands that have never had to deal with the customer and that experience, and all of a sudden it's really is a new world, isn't it?
Yeah, and obviously it takes a lot of effort to get that in place. I think when people think of e-commerce, they generally just think about the website, getting that up and running, and having that shiny storefront, and having that in correct working order is super important. You need to entice people in, but what people generally remember is everything that probably happens after that. It's kind of, did it arrive on time? How easy was it to return it? Because if those bits go wrong, they're quite bad things to go wrong. They generally involve some customer pain, significant amounts of sometimes, because people don't want to give up their time because you delivered a faulty product, or the courier threw it over a hedge, or whatever happened in that kind of process. So managing that through and having the infrastructure in place, capabilities in place, or partners that you trust that are going to be able to deliver the level of service that you require for that is really, really important, and make sure that's all kind of connected and works as it should. All the unsexy bits that need plugging together, all the plumbing, if you like, of the e-commerce operation behind the scenes, that needs to be in good working order. And there's generally, when you first get into kind of building your e-commerce channel, you'll generally find you have a lot of workarounds, we'll tend call them if you like, but it's just firefighting that you're having to deal with on a day-to-day basis until you can operationalize that and put processes in place or fix things in the back end. But a lot of companies do go live with these kind of gaping holes in the back end there, and there'll be some poor operational person in the background kind of fixing the holes or doing manual things to make sure that orders still flow, things happen in the back end. Which again, if it's manageable and you've got people in place that can do that, you can get away with it. But as soon as that goes wrong, things start to pile up and back up in behind the scenes as well. So making sure your plumbing's in order is definitely needed.
Making sure your plumbing's in order. I like that. Maybe that's going to be one of our notes on the follow-up. Make sure your plumbing's in order. Simon Bainton has had to leave the call. He's got a conference call very soon, but he did ask a question to me privately to put to you, Phil. And it was about where this he was interested in where this might be applicable in the future in leisure, particularly with reference to ancillary services that is growing within airlines and hotels. Now, I can't give you much context around that, and Simon's going to get together and we can maybe have a three-way conversation about it. But I guess that so many organizations now need to have some kind of way of transactioning or having some sort of transactional process with a customer directly, and that's happening more and more, isn't it? Whether it be with hotels or with going on holiday, you want that process to be smooth and that customer service to be smoother. So that's an opportunity, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, any kind of customer touch point potentially has, can be turned into a digital journey potentially. I think within reason. The reason that it hasn't been done in the past isn't not necessarily that it can't be done. It's just it's really cheap to use people generally. Yeah. Generally, it's quite cheap to use people, depending on the location and what the task is. People are very good at stuff. We're all walking pretty adapted supercomputers in our own right, that can do very complex tasks and can operate outside of the box. And to change that to then some kind of machine interface, which has, rigid rules, perhaps when you're working in an environment like a hotel desk or something where you have to be able to, manage multiple different things and do things, that's a complicated thing to translate. And most human actions is why we haven't got, self-driving cars or anything, yet, because it's actually pretty difficult to take all those inputs in, manage it, and then do some kind of output. It's actually quite a complicated thing to do. And when you get into kind of AI and these other things, actually most AI is fairly rudimentary these days. So that's the reason it hasn't been done. Not that it couldn't be done, it's just cheaper and easier to just put a person in that spot. But that's kind of rapidly changing. And also push requirements around whether or not they actually want to deal with a person or deal with the machine where they can just punch a couple of buttons and be on their way, or push a few things around on an iPad and it's finished. That's changing as well. So again, the market moves, customer expectations move, and also customer training, for want of another word, in that they get used to using technology. Yeah. Again, it's kind of giving your grandma an iPad, is she going to be able to use it or not? Generally, customers can only operate, technology that they've been exposed to. So if you bring in cutting edge technology into your retail environment or whatever environment that be, customers won't know how to use it because they haven't, been trained to use it. They have to get used to using that level of technology as well. So it's how appropriate that then becomes in that particular market. But most interactions that require yes and no inputs and things like that, you generally be able to change those into that. So it depends on what it's trying to do, really. But within leisure and airline, certainly there's lots of e-commerce touch points. I mean, we had a conversation the other day about a China solution for online and e-commerce online entertainment within airlines and things, and how you would go about kind of making that work. Because most things end up in some kind of e-commerce process. You know,
Yeah.
generally money is changing hands at some
Yeah.
point in whatever, you know, business operation is happening. So it revolves back to that. So I think, again, it's whether or not the technology and the level of technology is appropriate to that situation. But again, that's rapidly changing.
And the technology is coming into everyday life. So whether you go into a pub or a restaurant, you know, ordering your food on an app and Weatherspoons, you could do that, and it was kind of a bit of a, oh, this is a novelty. And I think that's clearly now going to be more of the norm, and we're going to see that more often, aren't we?
Yeah, it's everywhere now. I mean, here in Taiwan, literally, I'm living off Food Panda. So, you know, you punch a few buttons and the guy on the moped arrives and dinner is here. And, you know, we've seen that, and the growth around those solutions, and, you know, the likes of Uber and these super apps and things like that. It's just, again, it's collectivizing what is a human process, but just putting an interface in front of it as well, and doing it in a slick enough way, and in a way that's, you know, intuitive enough that customers can get on board with it and accept it and use it. And if you get that right, then yeah, you can have some huge success.
Listen, Phil, it's been absolutely brilliant. I've found it really interesting and fascinating. I don't know if anybody else has got any questions they'd like to ask. If you do, then you know, just shout up now. But we're coming up to, I think we're coming up to just past, or just coming up to 12 o'clock. Has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask Phil? Just lastly, before we go, Damien.
I'm interested to know how you make the e-commerce platforms accessible for people with disabilities, but also give a luxury feel to customers.
Is this from a customer point of view accessible?
Yeah.
So customers using. So yeah, accessibility can be quite an issue. So some platforms, depending on kind of how they've been built, do have some accessibility features in them. Normally, though, it's more tailored towards like color blindness and things like this. So actually, I think probably disabilities are still underserved in most e-commerce environments, and probably in retail environments to a large extent. So there is probably some significant amount of work. Yeah, there's definitely something significant around that. I think the harsh business reality around that, some of that is that as a customer group, it's underserved because the capital isn't there to kind of spend on the advancement of that, which is a shame. So it depends on the business and how forward thinking they are around some of those topics. I think perhaps the more broad-minded, ethical-based companies might have some solutions around that they've tried in the past, but I've yet to see anything really well implemented.
It's quite shocking when you think about the disabled market have over £1 trillion to spend on products and services globally. So it's a misunderstanding of the market, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think again, it's a broad range of needs as well. So I think from a retailer perspective, it's like, how do you address the many different needs that might be available? I think the platform that gives features out of the box to help with some of that will probably do very well. I think if they can build that into some of the SaaS platforms, with some thinking around that, options available to retailers to turn on and off potentially. I'd be
really interested to have a conversation with you about that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So it's a super interesting topic. So, yeah.
Reach out to me on LinkedIn and we'll set that up.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Damien. Really appreciate that. It was a really, definitely very, very, very interesting area. And you're quite right. It's an unserved or underserved market, isn't it, Phil? Has anybody else got any questions? Atiba, how are you doing? You all right?
I'm fine. I just wanted, it's not so much of a question, maybe, something could be added, but what I thought was useful and very, correct was the comment, we've talked about it being fairly easy to get the site up and running, and you get your shiny, shop front there, and logistically and technically it works. And we did talk about some of the other things that you need to consider, but the conversation there was mainly around consumer post-purchase logistics. So if they want to return it or whatever other customer experience stuff. But the other things that were touched on, which I think were, spot on and under considered when people do these things, is the tax stuff, the regulatory compliance, the connecting with the local banks' payment methods, potential requirements for insurance. Those very, as you put it, unsexy pieces, but very, important pieces need to be taken into consideration. And I think when people are considering sort of a direct-to-consumer play, many project teams may not or may underestimate the importance of those aspects of it. And I think, again, I was spot on, and that can make or break your venture. So I just thought that was something that I felt was interesting that I wanted to just highlight.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's the piece that gets forgotten the most. It's the piece that we generally have to tell people about again and again because it's not been a factor. And it's not necessarily that the business is wanting to ignore it or anything. It's generally that they just haven't had to do that before. They haven't had to address that before in any fashion. It's likely that the people in that business, unless they've come from a D2C background or retail background, the finance team won't have been looking at this kind of stuff before. The finance director won't have been looking at these kind of transactions before. They've not had to deal with individual, credit cards, taking and dealing with those and chargebacks and checking for fraud and all these other kind of pieces in the background. Merchant of record, seller of record, responsibility, again, unsexy stuff, but really, really important if you're not going to get caught out by legal tax or any other issues. And obviously around all of that is data protection as well, and that is paramount these days as well. So if you get caught out by GDPR, potentially that e-commerce could be just a fraction of your overall global business, but if you get caught out for a GDPR infraction because of your e-commerce business and then suddenly they're coming after a few percentage of your entire global revenue, well, then you've got quite a big problem that you need to deal with. So
and the
getting
whole
that right.
Security as well, as you said, the data protection related to that is security. So
InfoSec's super important.
The impact of that on your brand. Yep. So that's me.
Thank you, Atiba. Andy, you had your arm up physically there, and I saw you, mate. So go for it. And then I think I'm going to bring Tracy in, and then I'm going to wrap up. Okay. So cheers, Andy.
Okay. Very much on the payment side. What you're actually doing, as you just alluded to there, was you are changing the entire profile of your accounts department's handling of things, because instead of having one purchase order and one payment coming through that's going out to a retailer, suddenly they've got thousands of these things which are coming in via credit card, individual transactions, some of which are going to be fraudulent, some of which are going to be bounced back, some of which are going to be charged back, all sorts of things happening there. So you've got all of the costs of actually dealing with that new volume of stuff, the costs of actually trying to understand it all, and actually the dealing with the individual customers for their refund transactions and things like that. So it can be a really significant impact. Plus you've got all the PCI compliance, plus you've got all of the GDPR things to deal with. So, sometimes in defense of retailers, they're actually acting as a barrier between the customer and the supplier to the supplier's benefit, because it means they don't have to deal with all of this fine-grained detail. They just deal with the one big order for 1 million whatevers of it, rather than 1 million separate orders, which is a lot different in terms of cost profile, in terms of handling it. End of.
Thanks, Andy. We've heard from Andy. Phil, obviously, you've got a huge amount of experience. I want to bring in a lady called Tracy. Tracy, the reason I'm bringing Tracy is because Tracy and I know each other. Tracy's been on a lot of our calls over the last 3 months. And Tracy, during lockdown, you've launched 2 or 3 e-commerce websites on your
8.
own?
I've launched 8.
Oh my God.
5 of them are automated. 3 of them are classic e-commerce. 1 is WooCommerce, and 2 of them are Shopify. So I've been really, really lucky. During lockdown, as work disappeared for the first time in a sort of 25-year career, I thought, you know what, there's no better time to do this. So I've seen the positives and the negatives from all of the different ways of doing this. WooCommerce has certain advantages, Shopify has certain advantages. But the bottom line is just make a list of everything that you know that you're going to need to do as a business, and make sure that you tick those off and make sure that you've met them in the best possible way. And yeah, slowly over time those will build, and as long as you've got your marketing right and your client base, you're absolutely great, you know, good to go.
So Tracy's got no questions for you, Phil. She's nailed this. No, nothing.
That's absolutely fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic. It's exactly what I was talking about. Is that the platforms and the ability to get to market now is so easy. Well, relatively easy. I'm sure you've done a hell of a lot of hard work in there, Tracy. But it's relatively easy now to get to market for new companies, smaller companies. Take on larger companies now. The technology allows people to get to market, and that's revolutionary, or almost, in that people can spin up businesses and grow and get to market very quickly and do some amazing things without the need for potentially millions of pounds worth of investment just to kind of get a storefront up and running. So it's a fantastic good news story.
But seriously, 8, Tracy. I mean, when we spoke last, it was 3 or 4, and now you've done 8. Just to quickly, which one? You've got the travel business, you've got the wedding stationery business.
I've got the wedding business, I have a beauty business, I have 3 Amazon 7,000 product affiliate sites, and a few others. So yeah, and this was interesting because about 6 months ago, I applied for a director level role in e-commerce, and they said I didn't have any skills, which was quite funny.
Oh, the irony.
Absolutely.
I think Graham, did you have a question for Phil and for everybody maybe?
Yeah, hi, hi everyone. It's my first talk. Yeah, great presentation. No, it's really just coming back on something Phil and I think Andrew said. I was involved in an insurance website. Yeah, and I implemented a lot of payment systems like PayPal and direct debit. And yeah, it was the downstream processes and fulfillment that everyone forgot, because suddenly we had, like was mentioned, people's jobs were changing. They had to do chargebacks, direct debits, all stuff that was never thought about. It was, get the websites up. Yeah, but how are we going to fulfill it? And even stuff like printing out your insurance booklet, which you think is quite simple. Well, there was like I think a week or a 5-day turnaround, and this changed. We had IPED, we had GDPR. So yeah, there was a lot of things that, the website's up, but that was like the 10%. The 90% stuff was hidden around the back. I think that's what Philip was saying. You have to then suddenly get dragged into, how do we do that? So it's just really sort of coming back on that. Yeah, it's not as simple as people think. And I think Tracy would probably agree with that. If she's done eight sites, you'd have probably seen the same sort of thing around the fulfillment side.
I think an important thing to recognise as well is what it imposes is a change of pace. So if you are a site which has been, or a company which has been used to, as I said, just dealing with one PO and sending that off to a retailer, suddenly having this, bang, 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 internet speed stuff having to be dealt with, it can actually torpedo the entire company, because you are suddenly changing gear, and not everybody's going to be prepared for it unless you're careful.
That's great. We implemented web bots, so you had online chat. Then all of a sudden the customer services team, something new. They're used to like emails and get around to stuff in perhaps 24 hours or 48 hours. All of a sudden they had customers online. Hey, what's happened on this? What's happened on that? And they had no access to certain systems because they were catching up, next day, transactional systems, things we bought online. But the transactional payment system and credit systems would only catch up that evening because they did a run. So suddenly they had no information, even though the customer wanted an answer there and then. So there was a lot of that. We're talking about like the customer impression. It suddenly something totally different.
That's brilliant. I think that we've all kind of come from such different angles on this, and it's really interesting. And Philip, thank you for your time. It's been absolutely brilliant. Really, really detailed presentation, and really well executed as well, by the way. You can tell you've done this many times before. This is not your first rodeo, is it, Phil?
I've done a couple of talks, but I wouldn't say it's every week or anything like that. But
it was really good. I can imagine you on a stage doing a TED talk on this. It was brilliant. So thank you for that, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Like I always say, we couldn't put on these events if it wasn't for the people attending. We're going to keep doing these events. We're going to try and keep it on a weekly schedule. We might change the times based on the fact that people are starting to come back into work. So we might start to look at Thursday after 5:30 maybe. We're also going to roll out some social events as well. Now, whether that's going to be at the moment face-to-face every quarter around the UK, or one thing we were talking about was maybe a virtual wine tasting. If that's your cup of tea, let us know, and we'll get that arranged. And one of our CTOs, ex-CTO of Nando's, who's in our network, he's like massively into his wine, so he said he would host it for us. So that'll be really, really good. If you've got any ideas of what you want to see on future roundtables, please join the group on LinkedIn, get involved with the networking. That's what kind of this is all about, really, to help people raise their profile and get people connecting and talking to each other and collaborating. Future roundtable events, I think Damien's going to be on one very, very soon, talking about diversity, specifically around people with disabilities and how technology is making things more accessible, and probably what we need to do more of, including e-commerce as well. We've got Mark Evans going to be talking about cybersecurity. Someone was talking about the group about cybersecurity, so Mark's very, very versed on that. I've got Linda Davidson, who's the current interim CTO at media agency Group M. She's currently using AI to manage Google and Facebook ad spend. The numbers are off the charts. She's going to be really, really good. Nigel Lemon, our CTO or ex-CTO of Nando's, will be talking to us about general business strategy. You guys, and girls, of course, Tracy has presented on a couple of others, but if anybody would like to present in the future, please let me know. Drop me an email, give me a call, or send me a message on LinkedIn, and we'll get that arranged. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining me, and we'll see you on the next roundtable. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks.
All right. Cheers, guys. See you soon.